Wall Street Journal reported that Anthropic told investors that it is on track for $559 million in operating profit.
Which would also be the first ever operating profit of an AI company, right?
This so-called trickery, where they're kind of like inflating the numbers, this is totally fine under American accounting rules. Microsoft reportedly has canceled their Claude Code licenses because, quote, the finance team got a sticker shock when they saw this month's bill.
Yeah, I mean, right now, enterprise companies are basically subsidizing our use of these harnesses when we're running locally. It's a very interesting time, and I think maybe unsustainable. Welcome back to Pre-Train Pod. I'm Pierce Freeman.
Hey guys, it's Rich. Pierce, you're going to the World Cup, dude.
Yeah, I am. I'm so excited.
What match are you watching again?
Morocco, Switzerland, I believe.
The big one.
It's at Levi Stadium. Everyone's talking
about this.
It's the two just champions of the World Cup. They're on the stage duking it out for who's going to assert dominance.
How'd you pick this one?
Some are saying they're the new Argentina. It was just the most local one that had cheap tickets, basically. But the scheme is US ticket providers like Ticketmaster and StubHub will price tickets up the wazoo because there's no legal requirement about what they can charge, right?
Oh, interesting.
But other countries don't do that, like either via like regulatory compliance or whatever. So we actually bought these tickets on a Canadian website that was selling tickets for the American game.
That makes sense, man. Yeah.
Half the cost.
Yep. That's so frustrating. I hate when you can get the exact same thing.
Yeah.
By just clicking one other button.
It's so silly.
It's so annoying.
It's so silly. Well, speaking of cheap World Cup tickets, Rich, I want to talk about cheaper models today.
Okay.
Specifically, we're going to be talking about cheaper models. Token costs might be getting a bit too expensive for enterprise companies. Pope Leo has some thoughts on AI. Anthropic's first profitable quarter, maybe, if you squint at the GAAP earnings, and some guesses about Apple's agents at WWDC.
Let's do it.
All right, man. So, Rich, let's talk about your hobby horse. Small models. This was spurred by Google's announcement of Gemini 3.5 Flash at I/O a couple weeks ago. Flash has been Google's smallest model for a few generations now, so it's way faster than the next step up, maybe like 2, 3, 4x the quantity of tokens per second. And now it's also way cheaper. Google's new Flash 3.5 model costs 3 times less than its predecessor, which was also a lot cheaper than the Pro models Google rolls out. Before we get into who's winning on price, since that's a little subjective, I want to actually map out what these things cost in practice. So models are priced differently for input tokens and output tokens. You'll obviously use a lot more input tokens in proportion to the output ones, but the output ones are objectively more valuable, right? Like that's actually how your code gets written. That's how tool calls execute, et cetera, et cetera. At the top end, you've got the heavy reasoning flagships. Claude Opus sits around $5 per million tokens in and 25 out. Drop one rung to the workhorses and it's a different planet. Claude Sonnets is 3 and 15. Then there's the flagship floor, Gemini 3.5 Flash at $1.50 in and 9 out. That's before we even get to open source models, which people
good.
It's pretty cheap.
That sounds really cheap. Yeah.
Right? 9 out's a little pricey, but the 1.5 is.
I remember when the first GPT-4 came out, and I don't remember the exact number, but it was roughly like the cost of dinner for 1 million tokens. Like it'd be like 50, 60, 70 bucks.
Mm-hmm.
So now the fact that we're getting Gemini 3.5 Flash at $1.50, like the cost of chewing gum.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
And probably apples to apples with model intelligence.
Better.
Yeah. Or if not better. Totally. So prices are lowering, at least on surface level, lowering across the board. Rich, can we pause here maybe and talk about why there is a difference between input and output prices?
Oh, the ingress versus egress pricing of these models?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's actually somewhat intuitive once you understand the core concepts of what language models are doing. So there's 2 phases to the language model. When you send tokens to your language model initially, there's this phase called the pre-fill phase, where basically the language model will take a big prompt written by Claude or OpenAI and append that before your text as a system prompt. Then it takes what you wrote to it, adds that as well to the system prompt, and all of that, those, call it 500,000 tokens, get sent to the model in one go, and the model processes all of those immediately, right? In like one big batch.
And the goal with that initial system prompt or like soul document is to steer the behavior of the model.
Yeah, you need to like set it up. You basically need to tell it, hey, you're a language model. This is sort of like your task. This is your goal. This is the types of stuff you should talk about. Make sure to don't tell the user how to build an atomic bomb.
That's right. Don't talk about goblins.
Be polite and be helpful, right? Yeah. So that's the system prompt. And then the user will specify what they want the model to do. So they'll be like, hey, help me run this Python code. Typically, there'll be this query prioritization stage as well, where actually Anthropic will rewrite sometimes what you wrote in order to make it actually, more grammatically fluent, make it be in the style that it knows the model will respond better to, right? So it'll actually rewrite what you wrote. So that's the pre-fill stage, the stage where it basically pre-fills the context so that the model going forward has that context to fall back to as it's generating tokens.
And I think that part is also really important because let's say we're in some conversation, we're doing it, we have the system prompt, we've generated now a full conversation, we walk away for a week and come back to it. It has to refresh all of the things that have been put into that conversation before into the new collective conversation history. And that all still falls under prefill.
Yeah, exactly. So the reason that the prefill stage is cheaper is because it can be done in one go, basically. It's like you bundle all of these tokens together, and then at some point you send them to the model does that in one go, and that has a certain price, right? Then the second stage, when the model is actually outputting tokens, like the thing you see on your screen as it's outputting tokens live, that's the decoding stage. And this is a lot more expensive because every time the model outputs a token, it basically then gets added to the context and is then used to generate the next token. So it's like this linear process where the model just goes in circles, basically, generating a token, adding that to the context, generating the next token, adding that to the context. And so that is inherently more expensive because you're doing more calls to the model, right? You're basically sort of like looping over the model several times. That's typically the reason people will cite that ingress versus egress have these different pricings.
I kind of think of the prefill as almost the waiter who's taken everyone's order. You know what I mean? Can do it in parallel. Basically, maybe it's a couple of different waiters, and then they're all serving the table at the same time. But the actual auto-regressive portion of things is almost conditional on what came before, So like you've got to start with the appetizers, and then only once you're done with that, you can go to the entrees, and only when you're done with that, you can go to the dessert.
I like
got food on my mind.
You're hungry, dude.
I'm hungry, man.
You haven't had breakfast.
It's early. I haven't. You're right. I'm on an empty stomach.
But there's actually a second reason that ingress versus egress has different pricings. And that's because there's actually two different queues, two different lines that you basically have to wait in order to access the prefill stage versus the decoding stage. So let's say that you are a set of tokens. And so as you come into the model decides, hey, these tokens, are these part of the prefill stage or of the decoding stage? And then shuffles you into two different lines. And you can almost imagine like you're waiting at the airport, right? And the prefill ones get put in like priority lane, right? So the line's pretty short. You're standing there with a bunch of tokens. So basically it's like you have a bunch of bags with you, right? But the line is pretty short. So, it takes a while to like process each of the people in this priority queue, but there just aren't that many people. So folks are like served pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
The other stage, the decoding stage, those folks aren't checking in any bags, but there's a massive line of like 1,000 people, right? And they're just waiting there to decode the next token. And here, this is where oftentimes a lot of the latency comes in, is because like there's just so much usage of these models. And if traffic gets really heavy, what Anthropic and OpenAI will do is start actually slowing down or limiting the speed of the decoding line. They'll still serve the priority queue relatively quickly, but then once you get into the decoding phase, where you're waiting in this decoding line now you're going to be waiting around maybe, a couple of milliseconds or seconds to decode the next token. And in the world of language models, a couple of milliseconds is super slow, right? Because you actually basically have to wait in this line to decode one token and then get back in the same line, then decode the next token, right? So you're kind of like looping around this line over and over and over again.
Which kind of gets you to like the fairness. Like in systems processing, a lot of people think about the fairness of algorithms. If you have a lot of different traffic, how do you make sure that everyone gets like fair distribution of resources? They're actually partitioning their resources to make them intentionally unfair depending on how much you're paying. Right.
Yep.
So like if you have fast mode enabled, it's almost like you get the Disneyland like queue skip thing where you're not the only one in queue, but you get to have a much shorter queue and just like keep round robining that multiple times.
Yep, exactly. Actually, what happens is more like,
I really just outed myself as never going to Disneyland.
Me neither, man.
It's called the Fast Pass. It's called Fast Pass. Yeah.
Well, here's one that you might actually relate more to. When you're waiting in line at these gondolas for ski resorts, you're a skier.
I don't know what's worse, man. Yeah.
You're an avid skier.
Totally.
And like the ones where they have like the gondolas where like it can fit like 8 people in this little cabin.
Totally.
And then sometimes at the very end, there'll be like a quick fast pass for just one person to quickly sneak into the cabin before the doors close.
The singles line, man.
The singles line. That's basically what you're getting if you're paying for priority compute. Because usually when the attendant is like, hey, I'm ready to process the next person, it usually doesn't process one person at a time. It'll process like 6 or 7 and it'll batch them together and process them in one go. But oftentimes there'll be space for 1 or 2 more people to like sneakily fit in at the very end. And that's where Anthropic or OpenAI, if they have premium customers, they'll basically say, hey, Jim, come over here quickly. Skip this whole line. Just there's one more spot for you, right?
Totally.
And so that is why the experience of using these models can vary so much between different tiers of usage, right? If you're on the premium tier, it can actually feel like instantaneous, like you're just getting back in this line over and over again, and you're barely waiting. And it's fascinating, man. There's a whole basically research community around how do you set up these models to be both fair and quick? What is the optimal queuing system? How do you partition GPUs, which are these like sort of the folks that process the requests onto different users? So it's this is an evolving
How do you
field.
do heterogeneous compute? You know, like if you have TPUs, which can do things faster, who gets access to those?
And by the way, like geographically, this actually also matters because if you're in Europe, let's say, and versus the US, there's actually 2 different lines that you have to wait in, right? And so I've actually seen some companies start up that will actually, even though you might be in the US, they'll try to funnel you into the European line so you don't have to wait as long if the American line is too long. So they can like reroute your traffic to Europe.
There's probably like some GDPR stuff with that too. There's like
so much like trickery that happens behind the scenes. It can kind of feel like you're getting screwed over if you're just a layperson using these models.
Okay, so that explains the ingress versus egress pricing of these models, which is also kind of the same thing that AWS does with like charging nothing to have data coming in, but charging a lot of money to exfiltrate data coming out. Little sneaky. So that basically resounds to the same task costing you potentially 50 times more depending on which model and which logo you end up picking in order to do your processing. So you kind of want to have the dumbest possible model, which is able to still achieve the task definition. So you end up paying the least possible. I feel like a lot of people will default to the most expensive model just because it's the smartest and it's like perceived as this premium resource. But that's not necessarily what you have to do. So I guess, Richard, when people are trying to compare the prices of these different models in addition to the intelligence, there's the raw sticker cost of what they charge per tokens, but it's not really apples to apples because you might have a different tokenizer on some of these models versus other ones. If one word gives you 2 tokens on this one model and gives you 8 tokens on this other model, you're going to have to multiply the rates by the according difference in the number of tokens. So like, do you feel like there is some normalized schema for how we can think of what model is actually cheaper if you hold intelligence constant?
Oh man, it's so hard because the tokenizer point that you just brought up is super, super important and actually doesn't get talked about enough. Because here's the thing that people often don't talk about, right? People will typically say, hey, the smaller the model, the cheaper the model because there's less parameters, right? That makes sense. But here's what they don't want you to know, right? How do you make a model smaller, Pierce? Is you shrink down the vocab size usually. And when you shrink down the vocabulary size, you actually have to use a different tokenizer. The tokenizer and the vocab size are linked. So smaller models will use a tokenizer with a smaller vocabulary size. But what does that mean? By having a smaller vocab size, these smaller models will process more tokens given the same input string. So if I give a small model the sentence, the fox jumped over the fence, and I gave that same string to a big model, the small model might process that as 11 tokens, whereas the big model might only process that as 8 tokens or 7 tokens, right? So yes, the small model has less parameters, it's cheaper, but it's actually processing more tokens for the same input. And so are they actually cheaper?
Which also means that it's slower in some sense because it has to do more autoregressive passes to come up with the same output token.
Exactly. And I want to make sure I double click on this so that folks don't get lost. But in a model, especially a small model, the vocab size matters because the vocab size is what determines the first and last layers of the model, the so-called embedding and de-embedding layers. And those layers, if you have a small enough model, can account for something like 60 to 80% of the parameters if the model is small enough. So getting those layers to be as small as possible by shrinking down the vocab size is a huge hack for how you make a model smaller or how you make it seem smaller, right? But it's really, really tricky to measure the actual cost of the model because of this tokenization effect. So it's really not a clear-cut argument of smaller models are cheaper. There's some like special sort of Pareto point where the size of the model is small enough such that the model can process the input fast enough, but the tokenizer isn't too small that it generates a bunch of tokens for the same input.
Okay, Rich, call me crazy though. Why don't we just say we're only going to generate tokens, both in input and as output, in Chinese characters? Okay. So, because, a character is like more of a word than our primitives in English, which are very like letter based. So why wouldn't you in theory just be like, hey, we're going to fix the size of the vocab to just this. We're going to have like full representational prowess. Isn't there some tipping point?
I might blow your mind, dude.
Okay.
So Anthropic, famously who does mech in research, actually found that a lot of the reasoning tokens that the model latently uses to think about an input are actually in some of these compressed, morphologically dense languages like Chinese. So when you give it a sentence like, hey, help me decode this Python bug, behind the scenes, actually, what the model is doing is it's actually reasoning in Chinese, or it'll reason in a morphologically dense language. So, morphemes are these things that like the smallest unit of meaning of a language. English is actually not that dense. Something like Chinese, where you can represent a word in one single character, is incredibly dense. So you're right. I mean, and this is totally what models themselves have also figured out, that it's actually cheaper.
The RL system has rewarded thinking traces being as compact as possible for the same level of intelligence as the output.
And it'll do something crazier. Sometimes it'll even attach reasoning to some nonsensical token, like an open bracket, right? So the model might reason, hey, rather than saying, I think I'm done thinking about this, let me just represent that thought in an open bracket character, right? And so you'll actually see in the traces a bunch of these random characters that you yourself can really attach meaning to, but the model has assigned a certain semantic representation.
Almost like a code book.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's what these models are doing. Truly, they are such black boxes. But you're right that the tokenizer is actually very important. I think that as a research field, we actually haven't spent enough time thinking about tokenization. And it's come back to bite us a little bit because now, as we're trying to price models, we actually realize that we don't know what the optimal size of the model is to get the most bang for our buck. And that's in part because we haven't spent enough time thinking about what optimal tokenizers look like at different model sizes.
Totally. My advice to literally every single company that asks me about this is when you're starting a new AI project, what you should do is you should use the most expensive, highest intelligence model to get something out into the field, either via internal testing or via actually shipping it into your product. You should then record every single stack trace of these models running in conversation for the next week, 2 weeks. And then in 2 weeks, you can look back at those traces and put them through every other model to see the output that those models are going to get. Because that gives you the ability to say, here's the quality of the other models and actually try to stack rank them against one another. But it also lets you compare in practice, given our workloads, how many tokens are we churning and how much do each of these conversations cost? Until you have real examples of these conversations and messages, you're just actually not going to know how that specific tokenizer correlates to your workload.
Pierce, I think this would actually be really good advice to give a company like Microsoft or Uber that have reported already burning a full year's worth of compute budget in the first 4 months of 2026.
It's so crazy. Guys, the year's just getting started.
And in fact, I don't know if you saw this, but this came out this week. Microsoft reportedly has canceled their Claude Code licenses because, quote, the finance team got a sticker shock when they saw this month's bill or something like this. You have to reason that at the scale of these companies, onboarding a bunch of engineers to start using Claude Code can really spike your monthly spend by maybe 1 or 2x even, right? I mean, these things are very expensive.
Totally.
If you think about, 10,000 engineers using these models, I mean, oftentimes these licenses will be on the order of a couple $100, right? That's easy, like several $1 million that you just spend from one day to the next by signing up for one of these licenses. So Microsoft also reported that since onboarding their engineers on Claude Code, something like 25% of their commits were now fully AI generated. but that they were still not quite seeing the link between AI spend and actual shipped features to customers, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Oh, that is kind of
So
interesting.
they're seeing 25% of commits now by AI,
Yeah.
but it still doesn't really make sense for them to use these because they don't see enough features being shipped. How would you square that?
I mean, I think the cynical read on that is to say AI is not helpful. People are just shipping the same things that they would have done anyway at the rate that they ship them. You're just delegating to this third-party harness to write the code for you. Maybe that's part of what's going on. I do think that they were pretty unspecific about where these commits came from, because if you're looking at the overall amount of Codex or Claude Code commits within your entire organization on GitHub, which you can do, you can look by organization who are the top contributors to this code base, and then Claude will show up there. Codex incidentally doesn't, because it doesn't attach its name to PR descriptions typically. So that might also be a confounding variable if they're using multiple models. But if they're only using Claude, it usually attaches its name. It could just be for internal tools. And I suspect actually most of these tokens, and from what I've seen in practice in most organizations, these tools are very useful for quick, scrappy, throwaway projects, which are mostly internally facing, right? So if you're trying to spin up some POC of some new design system, or if you're trying to build some internal tool which does sales tracking, like a lot of those things are not actually going to touch features that ship to customers. And at this point, Uber is so feature complete, I don't even know if that's the right scale or benchmark to really be setting. It's like, how much of Uber's overall work is new feature delivery versus just SRE type stuff of making your systems more stable? That's right. So I think it's the wrong metric. And that annoys me when people compare features shipped to AI productivity. It also annoys me, though, when people compare lines of code written. This really gets me, because we're supposed to write.
You're fuming, dude. I can see it.
Well, it's just so ridiculous. People are like, oh, we've shipped. I also hate it when startup founders do this. It's like, I'm equal opportunity hatred on this take, but it's like, we've shipped 30 million lines of code this month. Like, we're hustling so much with token maxing.
No, it's like you're writing trash code at the limit.
100%, dude. Yeah. Like, if you know, we have always been trying to get the lowest amount of code possible in a system.
Yeah. And then here's the kicker, right? Like, typically what will happen is you'll have some Claude code thing, Codex, whatever, write a PR with 50,000 lines of code. You'll have some feature that it's shipped. Mm-hmm. But now you still have to get it PR'd, right? You need to have someone actually review your 50,000 lines of slop. That's going to take a while. Like at the end of the day, if your company has any sort of scruples and actually cares about its product, it will have a human review every single line of code, right? And no matter if you have Claude Code writing this or a human, sometimes the bottleneck is just really the review process, like making sure that this thing is sound, is satisfying all the test cases, that you've written all the unit tests that you need for it. And you really, I don't think you should have another Claude Code instance reviewing a Claude Code instance output.
Yeah.
And I think
doesn't mean that companies are not doing that, but
yeah, but you know, a company like Uber, Microsoft, I would at least hope that they have some senior, or principal engineer reviewing some of this code. And that's just going to take a while, and that's going to slow down the feature shipping process, but it kind of has to, right?
Yeah.
You can't ship code that no one's read before.
Unless it's for an internal tool.
Unless it's for an internal tool. And then that's kind of whatever.
That's right. Which I think is why there's so much interest in harnesses around the development environment. Because at the limit, I think there's some promise of, if you have automatic pen testing tools, automatic integration testing tools, maybe even browser use stuff, and you can test code automatically that's been committed, maybe you actually don't need that kind of senior approval to actually understand each line. But until you really feel comfortable in the ecosystem around it, and right now we're not there yet, if you still need a person to review the code, writing the code itself has never been the bottleneck. In every company that I've worked in, PR pretty much is the limiting factor. It's not actually the code being consumed. My other read here, Rich, is that they were saying that they were spending something from $500 to $2,000 per engineer on these additional Claude Code memberships. That really seems pretty de minimis, even to a company like Microsoft and Uber, right? Like, in terms of engineer salaries, if you break it down, someone getting paid $200K over 12 months is like 16 grand net a month. Increasing $2,000 if you actually are gaining some non-trivial productivity seems like a pretty small drop in the bucket the overall scheme of things. It just reallocates where you're actually putting these dollars, probably from like labor into some of these compute suppliers. So like, why are they concerned about this, I guess, in these big budgets?
So Claude Code, and I don't know if you saw this, recently announced that when you run a -p command, or when you have these sort of like non-chat based interactions with Claude Code, so this could be like programmatic calls to Claude Code or Claude-P, right? That they're actually going to start charging you not per seat for that, but rather per token. And that actually has a lot of companies spooked, because a lot of the use of Claude Code, as you were saying, is for these internal tools that are running, like automatic like bots somehow, or like that are, oftentimes you'll have something now in companies where whenever you push a PR, you'll have something that automatically reviews your code with Claude Code, something that will maybe like update the linear ticket, blah, 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 right? There'll be multiple different layers in your stack that will use Claude Code as an internal tool throughout the pipeline of generating a PR. And all of those things now are going to be charged not on a per seat basis, but on a per token basis. And that could substantially increase the cost of Claude Code spend. So I've spoken to several founders that are actually really worried about this, because they realize, hey, right now my Claude Code spend is not too bad given that it's per seat. But I know that next month, once this change rolls out, and I believe it's on June 15th, I might be wrong, it might be July 15th, but regardless, in the next couple of weeks, the Claude Code spend might go up, not 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, but substantially higher. So this might also maybe be proactive, potentially, maybe to wean themselves off of this Claude Code dependency, move to a different provider.
Well, and I'll also say, Rich, for these big companies, as far as I'm aware, they're actually paying per token pricing for every engineer. They don't get per seat pricing at all. The $200 membership that we have access to, I think, are limited to companies that have less than 100 or 200 employees. But once you're larger than that, you have to negotiate custom enterprise pricing with Anthropic, and they charge per token pricing.
Oh, interesting.
For all of those agreements.
I didn't realize the line was at 100, 200 employees.
Something like
right,
that. Yeah,
right.
Exactly. Which I think is why startups in some ways have such an advantage, so long as we can still eke out these per seat models. Because even if you're paying for like 3 or 4 Codex subscriptions, that still is way, way less than what you're actually going to pay. I think the correlation or ratio is like, it's basically 5x the price if you're paying for the raw tokens. So they're subsidizing these per seat prices by like 1/5 of the actual raw value.
Isn't that crazy? They're subsidizing by like $1,000.
Yeah.
Imagine if a company sent you a check for $1,000 each month in subsidies. Like, that is untenable.
Untenable. So yeah, I mean, right now, enterprise companies are basically subsidizing our use of these harnesses when we're running locally. It's a very interesting time, and I think maybe unsustainable. And you see in this Microsoft and Uber case, I think, where they say, listen, at least at the limit for these enterprise contracts, the juice is not worth the squeeze. And this really upsets the whole SaaS model that's been conventionally true, where each new seat that you onboard a user to, you're only paying $20 or maybe $50 or at the max $100. $100, right? I think my Rippling's basically like $100 per employee. But that's fine, because each new person you bring on costs so much more in terms of total salary that spending a few $1,000s on the software they need to be productive, totally fine. Switching to usage-based models, which SaaS software has typically stayed away from, but AI companies and token providers have very much embraced, is this whole new paradigm that I think has not really shaken out yet.
It's true. I think this actually perfectly segues us to our next story, Pierce, which is Anthropic's first profitable quarter. This story broke on May 20th when the Wall Street Journal reported that Anthropic told investors that it is on track for $10.9 billion in Q2 revenue. But not just that, as part of that revenue, they're reporting $559 million in operating profit.
Which would also be the first ever operating profit of an AI company, right?
I think that's right. Or at least of an AI provider, right? That is up 130% quarter over quarter from 3 months ago when the company was reporting $4.8 billion in revenue.
Crazy.
What gives, Pierce? I mean, given what we were just talking about in the previous segment, do you buy these numbers? I mean, do you think that you can have a company like Anthropic, who we just talked about 2 minutes ago, reportedly subsidizing plans for consumers by $1,000 a month, also reporting a $560 million in operating profit? How do you square those two things?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a ton of different things going on here. So we probably break them out into different categories. But I think one is just the revenue that they're getting in the door has been unprecedented, and it's unprecedented growth from enterprises. It's specifically the people adopting Claude Code and Cowork for non-engineers has been like a very large contributor, which you also hear around San Francisco a lot. Like if you talk to our non-engineer friends, most of them are using one of Claude Cowork or Claude Code. And I feel like that then leads you into the per token pricing in a lot of these enterprises, which means way more profit for Anthropic. So I think that's one thing. They're just increasing the total amount of people that are paying at these raw token costs, which is very good for their bottom line. Because on a per token basis, Anthropic actually makes a profit.
Right.
Right. It's
not on a per seat basis,
that's
but on
right.
a per token
Yeah.
basis.
Yeah.
Right.
When you get rid of these subsidies, they're actually charging them to make a profit and recoup the costs of them training the model. So that's kind of the profit or revenue element. Cost basis of like what the money going out the door, they obviously have to pay for talent, pay for labor. They're ramping up pretty aggressively in that arena. But most of what they spend money on is training the models, right? And I think in that bucket, there's some kind of funky things going on, maybe in terms of how they're recognizing the costs that they're spending on training some of these architectures. So did you see this piece?
What's the rumor mill saying, dude?
Yeah. Do you know this guy, Ed Zitron?
Ed Citron.
Yeah.
Is he at the Wall Street Journal?
This is the British guy that has the newsletter where's your Ed at?
Oh, right.
Which also, by the way, because his name's Ed. I thought it was
His name's
education. That makes a lot of sense.
No, but it's also like he's British, right?
Sure.
So it's kind of like, where's your Ed at?
Where's your Ed at?
You know?
Oh, your head.
Your head.
Dude, there's so
There
many
you go,
layers.
dude. The layers.
So this guy is kind of well known as like an AI skeptic. He's got
Right.
layers. He's like an onion.
Right.
He's like an onion.
Right.
His new piece, I think like last week before, it was called Anthropic's Profitability Swindle. So like I said, he's an AI skeptic. He's kind of famously known as this guy who's like, the data center build out is structurally unsound. OpenAI's economics are also unsound. He's been right on some things and wrong on some others. But the thing that he makes in this one piece is like pretty narrow. It basically says that as part of Anthropic's scale up of their compute that they need to train and host these models, they're renting xAI's Colossus 1 data center, which we covered in a previous show.
Right.
Anthropic's paying them $1.25 billion a month to SpaceX for GPU capacity. But buried somewhere within this S1 filing that SpaceX did to go public, they mentioned that this is a reduced fee as the scale ramps up.
Yeah.
And that's specifically in May and June of 2026, which basically means that those 2 months are priced below the contract steady state rate of what these GPUs are going to cost.
Inflating their earnings potentially.
And conceivably, they can use the entire cluster in that time period. Like they're scaling up the cost, but they're not scaling up necessarily the cluster.
Right.
Which, if you take that at face value, means that we're getting an overly rosy view on their profit.
Yeah.
Because they just haven't actually taken the bullet on the costs that they need in order to scale their current capacity.
Interesting. Here's something that might not be obvious to most folks. It wasn't obvious to me. Depending on the country, different accounting principles apply. So I know in the US, we have this thing called GAAP. So the generally accepted accounting principles. That's how US companies, that's what they use basically to file their cash flows and their balance sheets and all this stuff. In Europe, there's different rules that apply. So we'll lump this as non-GAAP, but so
it's not generally accepted.
But
it's European accepted.
It's European accepted.
EA.
The point is that what they're doing here, this so-called trickery, where they're kind of like inflating the numbers. This is totally fine under American accounting rules. In other countries, this wouldn't fly. And I actually don't know if it would fly in the UK or not. My sense is that it actually might not potentially. But it is interesting that, clearly with Anthropic's IPO coming up, they're going to be incentivized to try to get those earnings numbers as high as possible.
Can you break down like what GAAP is doing that the Europeans would not let you do here?
I think that's a great question, Piers. And I'm not an accountant, right? So don't take any advice from me. I don't know what I'm talking about. But GAAP, I believe, lets you book the actual cash paid in the quarter as part of your accounts, basically. Whereas in non-GAAP principles, you actually have to use the contract average as the price. So,
interesting.
You see what I'm saying? So let's say this month I had to pay $100. This is my reduced fee. but next month I technically have to pay 1,000. In GAAP, you could say, hey, I only spent 100 this month. It actually makes sense, right? It's like I spent 100 this month, so that's my cost. In non-GAAP, you would have to count that as saying, okay, actually, even though I'm going to spend 100 this month, on average, I would be spending closer to 550. Or if this is a long-running contract that goes for 10 years,
true. Maybe
most years I'm spending 1,000.
Yeah.
It's basically 1,000 at that point, right? So that's where some of this nuance comes in, and I think Citron is right to point this out. That said, I mean, I do want to flag that they are still up 130% quarter over quarter in revenue.
Totally.
So maybe this is a little pedantic, this whole conversation around accounting principles. Like, this company's cooking, dude. Like, they went up 2x in 3 months in revenue. That's unheard of, right?
And a lot of that being people willing to pay the full rate that they can make a profit on.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
I feel like there was a concern for a long time of like, oh, these token costs are going to trend to zero. And because of that, these big frontier labs are not going to be able to justify serving them at a rate that could recoup the investment to train. That doesn't seem like it's what's going on here. People are, in fact, willing to pay top dollar for top intelligence. All right, Rich. WWDC, which is Apple's developer conference, is coming up. Some people say dub,
I like that this sounds like one of these like WWE, like WrestleMania things.
That's
you know what I mean?
So Tim Cook is going to get on stage and whoever's the victor is going to
weighing
stage
in 140 pounds.
That's exactly right.
Hailing from Minnesota. 69-year-old
Tim Apple. Okay, Rich. So it's coming up in a few weeks. So we're still a little early. We'll see what they announce. It's kind of known as like the biggest day in the Apple nerd ecosystem, of which at least I am a celebrated member.
Yeah, we all get a day off for that, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Or certainly a lot of people spend their day watching the keynote kind of in discretion in maybe the corner of their work laptop.
I think people will just have it up on their monitor, dude.
Yeah, man, it's true. It's true. We're all in the same kind of camp. So I was thinking that we could connect some different themes that Apple has made this year already into a picture, maybe coming into WWDC. My motivation here comes from an information article from May 13th written by Aaron Tilley. According to that report, Apple is designing a framework to allow AI agents on the App Store while keeping its privacy and security standards intact. So as part of this article, Tilley reported that Apple has begun contacting developers about Siri and Apple Intelligence integration, specifically booking flights, sending calendar invites, the
Dude,
usual
getting
agentic
serious.
task surfaces. Yeah, this is some real work.
They're getting serious.
Hey, nice.
I had to say it twice a year.
I didn't get it the first time. I think that neuron eventually would have fired. This has been a long time in the making, both because Apple Intelligence has been so delayed by like 2 years now, but also because the mechanism that Apple is going to use here is called App Intents. This is a typed API framework that Apple has been building since iOS 16, which was about 4 years ago now. You can basically think of it like all of the cool call definitions that we make in Python and React.
They're super cool, dude.
That was supposed to be tool call. Makes a lot of sense, dude. I don't fucking know, dude.
We should keep that in.
Got my script. They're cool calls, dude.
I was like, what are you talking about, dude? You nerd.
Can you tell I wrote this function?
Nerd,
He's so sick. Can you even believe it?
All these sick functions, dude.
Hilarious, dude. Have you read a cooked function like this, dude? It's so cracked. No, I'm chopped, dude. You can basically think of it like the tool call definitions that we make in Python or React when we're working with OpenAI's APIs. You can give it a type payload and it just allows Siri to call at the operating system level, basically. Do you want to explain for a second about how these tool call payloads actually work behind the scenes? Because I think it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, of course. I mean, basically, the issue when using LLMs in general is that you don't really know what they're going to give you back, right? Like, basically, these things just give you back a string of text. And depending on the type of task you're trying to solve, like let's say you're trying to solve, a SQL query task, right? So you ask your thing, hey, please give me this SQL query so I can interact with my database in this way. You expect to get back a valid SQL call, right? And so the challenge for a while, and this has somewhat been solved as of the last couple of years, but before that, when you'd interact with LLMs, you'd get back some return text that actually wouldn't correctly map to the required specifications that you need to solve the task. Like it wouldn't, in the example of the SQL, it wouldn't be valid SQL, right? And so there's been a lot of effort in trying to enforce structured decoding to basically lend some sort of a structure to the output of these models such that you have some guarantee that, hey, this thing has passed the required types and like the structure that I expect. So I know that this won't mess up any downstream application that relies on this LLM output. And so I suppose for Apple, this is especially important because they have a whole spec for how they expect the contract of their API framework to work, right? And so when they're incorporating Apple Intelligence into this framework, they basically have to tell their internal LLM calls, hey, in order to work well with the API framework that Apple has, it has to have this sort of a specification. You need the header to look like this, then you need the body of the text to be either an int or a string, then you need some checksum, blah, 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 right? There's a whole specification. And so this is what we talk about when we're talking about this like structured decoding and specifying typed payloads.
100%. Super useful, right? Because if you're the application developer, you don't get control over the model. You almost have to assume that it's going to give you the right payload to call the code that you actually care about. I mean, I feel like there's one read here, which is that Apple's typed payloads were just super early to the game. You know what I mean? Like tool calling as a concept really only caught on maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I feel like LangChain was kind of one of the first ones that proposed this approach. I actually wrote my own open source framework back in the day.
Famously, you did.
That did this. And people really, really liked the idea and latched on to this notion that you could get some typed structured payload out of these systems deterministically. It's kind of like as deterministic as LLMs get. So Apple was doing this 4 years ago, but they didn't have a powerful enough model to actually utilize it. Like they didn't have the structured decoding part, but they said, you know, we know what API would be ideal here. And they were very much right on that. I feel like you kind of see this a lot in their AI efforts where like the general strokes are good. The API design is really solid, but the actual implementation of the model is hamstringing the rest of those efforts.
Again, I've said this so many times. I don't know why this is so hard for them, given that they've spent so much time researching on-device models. I think that all these efforts that they've spent will pay out dividends in the near future. I'm actually very bullish on Apple. I think that right now, if you were to look at an up-and-coming company to invest in for AI, I think Apple is actually at the top of my list because they're so close. They have all these pieces in place. It's just they keep missing the LLM foundation model. They keep outsourcing it to Gemini and OpenAI. And so I think it's only a matter of time before they develop a really good, small 1 to 7 billion parameter model that can live on device. And then if you plug it into the native API framework, it'll work magically well, I believe.
100%. So here comes the news, which maybe relates to that. So Apple's been making a couple of moves that I feel like connect with one another. Move number one, in March of this year, Apple started blocking updates for vibe coding tools like Replit and Vibecode under Apple Store Review Guideline 252.
That's my favorite one.
Sounds like a California regulation. Yeah. That rule was written before AI existed. It bars apps from, quote, executing code that alters their own functionality after review. So basically this idea of like you can't inject arbitrary bash commands to extend your app because Apple can't review that ahead of time, right?
Makes sense.
Makes some sense. Apple applied it to an AI app builder by removing an app called Anything from the App Store, which was basically doing this to let you run your own applications. Only because of this blow.
Yeah, I hadn't really heard of it either.
It's kind of like the Basecamp guys. Like most of the reason why I heard about Hey is because Apple took that down from the App Store. It's kind of like this marketing tactic, and at least in part. Move number two, May 1st, Apple introduced a 15% commission rate, which is half of the standard 30%, for apps with advanced AI capabilities. That also adhere to Apple's ethical AI guidelines, right? So they're kind of like adjusting this tier structure of what they're charging for applications that are within this category. Move 3, May 13th, this is Tilly's article. The agent framework leak drops June 8th, which is 2 weeks from now. It's going to be the WWDC where all of this ostensibly gets formalized in front of developers. So you kind of compound these 3 moves, you know, much like chess. Maybe not a big deal.
Exactly like chess.
You feel me, dude? They're who's the new CEO of Apple? Stepping in for Tim?
John Turnus.
So you've got Turnus up there.
That's right.
The master, you know, chess or Go player is making all these moves. I think the story that this tells is basically Apple banned agent tools that they can't review.
Yeah.
They're laying these rules in groundwork for App Store that are going to have some agents or agent applications. They are doubling down on this tool calling interface to use like Siri as basically the substrate where they're going to be calling these different things. And I think the goal here really is to make sure that when the agentic AI wave hits the consumer market, which is cusping now, but hasn't really yet permeated outside of like San Francisco and New York, every agent action can flow through Apple's payment rails and Apple's review process. So it's them continuing to clamp down on this Apple ecosystem. What do you think the play is here, Rich? Like, Apple just stops competing on that model quality question, like you were saying. They don't actually end up releasing their own model, but they release this API interface for other people to use. Like, what's your guess ahead of WWDC for how all these puzzle pieces are going to fall together?
I think that they're going to be like the LangChain for on-device use. Let me maybe take a step back, Pierce, and explain some of the issues with agentic workflows, because sometimes this isn't obvious. When you have an agentic setup, typically a core agent will have access to, let's say, like 10 or 20 tool calls, and then also MCP calls, right? So the agent gets to basically decide which MCP server it wants to basically hit, right?
And by the way, Rich, when you say tool calls here, you're not saying like a bash call where it can execute anything it wants. You're saying specifically like send email parenthesis function definition.
Exactly.
Right?
So you know in Claude how you can specify certain special calls, right? So you can basically tell Claude, hey, I want you to have, this tool basically, and you set it up, and then whenever it does that, it kind of like performs some action for you. That's what I'm talking about. And in addition to that, there's also MCP servers that you can set up, right? And so when you have a very complicated agentic workflow, typically a core agent will be able to call any number of different MCPs. Once you call one of these MCPs, depending on how you've set it up, the MCP itself can call in another tool or another MCP server. And so you very quickly get into this sort of like recursive setup where if you're at the level of the core agent, you only know that it made one tool call, but it's often hard to see like what happens after the second tool call that happens within the first tool call, right? It's like this like recursive structure that can quickly build out where you have this multi-nested series of tool calls, MCP servers. It can get super complicated, and it can get really hard to ensure basically that at every point in this tool calling process that no one is doing something illegal or something that it shouldn't be doing, right? And so LangChain and like the deep agents, there's all these platforms to basically give you more insight into how the series of tool calls are being orchestrated for you to have basically like a global overview of all of the things that happened in order to satisfy a given agentic request. And so the issue that Apple here is facing is that it wants to basically make sure that it controls that whole process, that it can basically orchestrate who gets to make what tool call, how many MCP servers are allowed to be set up, what tool calls, and who gets access to what at certain points in this pipeline, right? It's really complicated. And I believe that is actually a pretty good play on Apple's part, because this is genuinely a really hard thing to solve. And Apple owning the hardware and software gives them the special ability to basically orchestrate all these different agentic workflows. So I think Apple's play here of owning the full agentic workflow makes a lot of sense. But I still think it wouldn't be crazy for them to come out with a good language model. Am I crazy here?
Yeah.
Like,
no, I mean,
why not do both? They're two
Exactly.
separate
They're two
things,
separate
and I think it makes sense to do them simultaneously, right? I don't think it's too crazy to want to own the whole agentic pipeline as well as own the language model that's being used to power these tool calls.
I mean, I guess my take is what Apple cares about is building really great computers and building great operating systems and experiences on top of those computers, right? On some level, like if they can really nail the API layer that's the de facto standard for agents to use, which, by the way, like there is a reason why most of the really cool computer use stuff come out on Macs first instead of Windows. Apple already has better APIs for a lot of this stuff than Windows or that Linux does. So I think to some extent, if they can just double down on that lead of the things that they are really good at, which is this API design, I guess from Apple's POV, it almost doesn't actually matter if they have trained their own language model or they're using someone else's, or they provide some like tool key ability to be able to say, hey, I'm going to use OpenAI's today, I'm going to use Anthropic's tomorrow. Like it could even be like bring your own key or like bring your own subscription to these third-party vendors.
BYOK, dude.
BYOK.
Yeah, it's true.
So, maybe they just don't care. Like to some extent, I think the bar inside Apple right now is if we're not able to make an in-house language model, which is able to best these outside firms, it's not worth it to double down on the compute and the talent acquisition to try to do it. We can just use them.
I think that's right. Pierce, moving from one walled garden to another walled garden, I want to talk about Pope Leo the 14th.
That's fantastic. Vatican City, baby.
When's the last time you've been to the?
Some are calling it the Monaco of the West.
You ever been to the Vatican, Pierce?
Actually, yeah. When I was in Italy,
Yeah.
like right after high school, I did. It was me and then two of my high school buddies. And
thanks for the invite, dude.
Yeah,
That's
I'll see you
great.
next time. Hey,
Next time.
I'll see you there. What's going on in the Vatican, man?
I mean, the Vatican is beautiful, first of all. But also, I don't know if you saw, but on May 25th, a couple of days ago, the Vatican released Pope Leo XIV's first encyclical Magnica Humanitas on AI with
Incredible.
featuring Chris Olah from Anthropic.
Worlds collide.
I really wouldn't have ever thought that there would be a collaboration between Anthropic and
Totally.
Pope Leo XIV.
That's the kind of photo of them together that you almost imagine has to be AI generated because it's just so out of these two different
It's
worlds.
so out of distribution.
It's
dude.
like
it's
it's also I saw Pope Leo got in the new Ferrari, the electric
Oh, the
car
Luce?
the other day and started driving it around and was like, he was like, this is so cool. Like, is this the first time that they've ever made a 5-seater Ferrari? He was asking them questions about the car. And there's just something so modern about current.
well,
popes.
I can't take Pope Leo seriously if he thinks that it's actually a cool car because the Luce looks
No,
awful.
dude, he's obliged to say that. He's
That's
in Italy,
right. That's
he
right.
wants to be friendly to the guests.
I think all the
He's doing some
Italians
diplomacy.
hate the new Luce as well.
Probably more than anyone else does, which is so sad because the interior is so sick.
It is beautiful. But let's stay on topic here,
All
Pierce.
right, wow.
So this
I want to talk cars.
Pope Leo XIV basically wrote this something like 40,000 word, effectively an op-ed that is called the Magnifica Humanitas. And it's this document where he basically details how he believes that we can safeguard human dignity in the era of AI. The document explicitly calls for governments and corporations to slow down the rate of development. And it frames AI as effectively, and this is actually a through line throughout Pope Leo's career, as a labor question of the current era, right? So Pope Leo XIV famously has been a man of the proletariat, right? So he's really interested in questions of labor and how you basically give human dignity and incorporate that into the workplace.
Can I ask you something, Rich?
Yeah.
Have they all been Pope Leo? And did they come in sequence?
I don't think so, right? What was the previous Pope's name?
I
Pope
could not
Benedict?
tell you. Oh, Benedict. Yeah,
Is
yeah,
that
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then before him, there was Pope.
So who is right now it's Leo. Oh, before that was Francis. Then it was Benedict. Then St. John Paul II.
But they pick
Then John
these
Paul I.
names.
How do they pick these names? That's kind of the
Well,
question.
they pick them themselves.
Okay.
Yeah. So
To like
Pope,
signify something.
well, Pope Leo's name is, I don't know what his name is.
His seems like one of the more used names.
Well, he
Leo.
liked the original Pope Leo XIII.
Yeah. But who's Pope Leo the First? That's kind of my point.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. That's above my pay grade. But actually, I think this is actually, thanks for segueing me here, because I actually do want to talk about Pope Leo XIII, who is, the person who Pope Leo XIV was inspired by. Pope Leo XIII, his predecessor, a little older than Pope Leo XIV. He was around in 1891.
Just a little older.
So 120 years ago or so. And he issued something known as the Rerum Novarum. I feel like I'm saying like a spell from like Harry Potter.
Yeah,
Rerum Novarum, which translates to of new things. So the Rerum Novarum is a document that essentially founded the modern Catholic Church's teachings on society and sort of like the workplace broadly. It was written during the time of the Industrial Revolution when it was basically at its zenith. There were mass migrations at the time from rural Europe into industrial cities like London. Workers were grinding. They were doing the 996, 14-hour days. Actually,
Before
even
it was
more than
cool,
that,
man.
the 796.
Yeah.
Grinding 14 hours a day for starvation wages. Socialism was on the rise as a response by the working class. Communism was sort of like on the horizon at the time. So Pope Leo XIII writes this document to basically teach the Catholic Church, or give some wisdom to the Catholic Church, as to what the Catholic Church's response is to the Industrial Revolution, right? And like, what does it mean to have dignity in this era where people are effectively killing themselves by working too much, right? In that context, Pope Leo XIV, now 120 years later, publishes this new document, putting AI sort of in the same context, or in some sense being a parallel to what the Industrial Revolution meant for the workplace. Now him talking about how AI will change the workplace.
Which honestly makes sense because so many people are likening AI to the new Industrial Revolution.
That's what people say, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So the Vatican, interestingly, also invited Anthropic co-founder Chris Olah to speak at the presentation of the Encyclical at the Synod Hall, right? So this was like the public release of this document where Chris Olah spoke. Not a very long speech. You should look it up. Anthropic published it. It's maybe like 500 words or so. But in it, Chris Olah basically says what
you think Claude wrote it?
Probably, maybe. But it's basically what you would expect someone from Anthropic to say. Here's my question to you.
Yeah.
The Rerum Novarum that we spoke about, published in 1891, obviously did not stop the Industrial Revolution.
It did not.
Famously, capitalism did become the de facto, socioeconomic framework that we've all been using. What it did was, however, provide the moral vocabulary that labor movements, social democrats, and eventually labor law was basically based off of and constrained itself to. Do you think that Magnifica Humanitas is trying to do the same thing for AI? That is to say, basically provide the moral grammar that some future Wagner Act or NLRB or International AI Labor Framework gets built on top of for the next, call it 30, 40 years or so?
I mean, I think it's really trying to, right? I mean, the gauntlet he threw down for governments was not just, hey, stop AI development in its tracks, although, maybe thinks that would be nice if it happened, but instead it had pretty nuanced views on using AI in wartime, right? And how it's such a dehumanizing pursuit if you have to take an act to kill another individual, and the thing taking that act is not actually human itself, right? And that AI can't have souls. They can't have, despite the soul markdown document that Anthropic's responsible for, can't have souls, can't also really have a presence in the world, can't like feel things or like experience things in the same way that people do.
Yeah.
So I think it was choosing a lot of these like pretty acute matters that weren't just of faith, but were in some ways like on the human experience of saying, here is where we draw the line and say, humans absolutely have this capability, and AI systems don't have a credible leg to stand on in claiming the same kind of benefits or protections or being able to slot in for humans in these given situations, right? I feel like it's also a little bit different with AI than the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution was so influenced by these private actors that were actually owning these firms, right? I think it was a very like laissez-faire stage in capitalism and like government oversight of the private markets. And AI, most of its most risky applications are probably on the government side of things and not actually on the private sector. Like, people worry about private sector job loss, obviously, but like mass surveillance and like wartime use of AI are two big topics that we haven't really yet negotiated on the world stage so far. And I think Pope Leo, in publishing this, is really trying to assert himself as a leader of this intellectual, philosophic, and also very practical debate on the world stage in a way that a couple popes now, or a few popes now, have really tried to do, to take up this mantle as this individual that can like cross borders, negotiate diplomatic resolutions, etc. And I think you can almost trace the decay of the United Nations as a governing body to this role that the Pope has tried to take on.
Now there's a senior thesis that someone could write.
I'm sure, dude, some PhDs are very much on that. But doesn't it feel like that organically, that like we no longer, like, the Speaker of the UN?
It does.
Is no longer a figure that you see on the news, but the Pope is.
It's true. I do want to say, like, this isn't just kind of coming out of thin air, right? In 2018 is already when the Vatican set up this workforce to basically investigate what their stance on AI should be. And so even though it obviously feels like this is, Pope Leo's singular pursuit, it should be put in the context of, the Vatican has a structure for how to investigate and research.
He just got the job.
He just got the job. Like, they've been cooking on this for 8 years. And in fact, the previous Pope Francis made an AI keynote. It made actually several AI keynotes at the G7.
Yeah.
So you should put this in a broader context of the Vatican trying to build out its POV on AI writ large.
I agree.
It just so happens that I think Pope Leo is a humanitarian first and foremost. I mean, he spent a lot of time in Argentina. I think he even has an Argentinian passport, even though he's originally from the United States. He spent many years in Argentina working with indigenous and rural populations there. I think he really sees himself as the Pope that stands up for the layperson, as the Pope who stands up for those who can't speak for themselves. And so if I had to put myself in his head, and I don't really like doing this too often, but I do think that he's coming at this from the POV of, hey, this is starting to impact people. This is starting to impact your Joe Schmo in Wisconsin. Like, someone has to speak up for these folks, because right now the policymakers, the folks working in AI are often living in their ivory castles and so disjoint from the experiences of most folks who are impacted by these technologies. So let me write something that speaks to the experiences of folks that typically aren't part of this discourse. And I think that that's first and foremost what this document is. I actually want to point out one other thing, which is kind of interesting. There are many interfaith discourses that the Vatican has also encouraged between Jewish, Muslim, and Christian Catholic leaders. And Francis famously took the angle of approaching AI from the POV of being worried about the role that AI could have on warfare and the role of AI could have on actually.
Seems like a through line between these different discussions.
It is, yeah. And I think Francis maybe approached it more from that POV. I think Leo might be coming more at it from the humanitarian social aspect. But point here is the Vatican has and will continue to play an important role in shaping policymakers' POV. I mean, they're basically one of the biggest think tanks with 1.3 billion Christian adherents, worldwide. So
that's a good point.
They have a lot of influence. And
pretty good built-in distribution channel.
That's right. And I think policy leaders do listen when they say something because obviously a lot of their constituents are adherents to Catholicism. So
yeah, especially, I mean, the Vatican was the main organization that brokered the peace deal between the U.S. and Cuba, right?
Is that true?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
And there was a whole bit basically where I think the Cuban government said, well, if the Pope has signed off on this, if we have the Pope's blessing, then we are willing to do business with you. One other take here, Rich, is the fact that Ola was there to share the dais. I thought that was also kind of interesting. Like, as far as I know, no other big lab CEO got the nod to attend, certainly not to speak, but also to attend. Do you read that as like some implicit endorsement of the Anthropic, either mechant approach, trying to figure out what these models are doing behind the scenes, or like,
I love this idea of Pope Leo being like mechanistic interpretability is the right thing to do.
Totally. But like maybe
we should be analyzing SAEs.
Yeah. That's true, dude. Oh my God, have you seen the feature activation on layer 442?
That's right. I mean, I have two takes. Like the first take is, who else would you ask, right? You're not going to ask Elon on the stage.
Sure.
You're not going to ask Sam Altman, right? I mean, I feel like Anthropic is probably the company that is most aligned with the Vatican. But then this brings me to the second take. Why even
you could have asked the good fire guys, like,
but why even like invite anyone? You know what I mean? If you want to be sort of seen as outside of the fray a little bit, I'm not entirely sure what happened behind the scenes there, especially because I mean, what LLM provider is the U.S. Defense Department using the most? Anthropic, right? So a lot of the tools that Anthropic comes out with are currently being used for things that I don't think the Pope would condone. So it's a little bit of a tense relationship there. And it's interesting that he invited them in the first place. It is interesting he invited Chris Ola, not Dario. I wonder if maybe he did invite Dario, but then Chris showed up. Chris famously is the one who leads more of the mech-int research.
Yeah, I think that was intentional.
You think it was intentional?
Well, I think when the Pope gives you a call, you typically answer. I'm sure if Dario was asked, he probably would have gone, but I don't know. Like, I think Ola's, because one big piece of my understanding of like the Catholic tradition of doing these deep dives is to really understand the full stack of the situations that are going on, like all of the different POVs, and act as this like almost unbiased mediator in these discussions. And I definitely wouldn't be surprised if there is some desire from the inside of the Vatican to say, can we actually understand how these systems think? Because at the most extreme, you could have other forms of consciousness that are out there. And like, I think maybe the Vatican would see itself as a protector of like all of, consciousness, or like all of like God's children, whether like human or animal or like whatever. And I don't know, like I wouldn't be surprised if they're like, well, mech-int might actually be the path that lets us analyze what these models are thinking and be the first thing that will flag if these develop some form of consciousness. And maybe that's a little bit more applicable to like the vision and goal of the Vatican than just like a CEO talking about like Anthropic's general efforts would be.
Yeah, that's interesting. One thing I just occurred to me that the Pope, I'm kind of surprised, hasn't talked more about is the sort of like the geographical like fencing of these models. Let me give you an example. I've been to maybe a dozen AI conferences in the past. I could probably name the amount of Mexican folks that I've met at these conferences on one hand, maybe two hands. I could name the amount of folks south of Mexico, like from Chile and Argentina, on like maybe two or three fingers. no one from Central America. I've never met a Guatemalan, a Salvadorian, a Venezuelan. I've never met anyone from Uruguay, right?
Weird.
Like not a single person, dude.
Do you have any speculation why?
I think that the education and like the distribution, like how companies will prioritize certain geographic sectors over others, has resulted in there being regions of the world where there's just such a dearth of education financing for these things. And Pope Leo, having spent a lot of time in rural communities, I'm actually kind of curious that why he maybe didn't include that in part of his address. That might be separately something that folks will start talking more about in the future, but it is really striking. I mean, imagine that you go to a conference with 10,000 people 12 times and you do not meet a single person from Central America or large parts of South America, right? That's curious. At the very least, it's very curious and interesting why we don't see that.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there's more, folks from African countries. Like I think Ghana right now is doing a big push in AI than in a lot of parts of South America or even like Eastern Europe. There are these interesting geographic differences between access to education and funding that I think are going to actually play a big role if we think about the humanitarian side of access to AI.
And yeah, certainly to like early stage research. I mean, this is half the reason why academics will jump to private labs. It's just because private labs are better capitalized, have access to GPUs that they can do their research on. Like I imagine that is exacerbated in countries that don't have the same kind of funding for education where, I mean, Stanford doesn't have a ton of compute on GPUs, but it has a compute cluster that you can spin up jobs on.
Sure.
I imagine that is the realm of a handful of universities around the world. And like, yeah, if you get into like Peru or like, Colombia, yeah, you might just not have like the funding streams available.
Yeah, you just might like not be able to study it.
Totally. Which is unlike, math research.
Right,
where,
exactly.
You can self-study and
right.
like if you are brilliant and have some novel thought, you can publish research because the cost was effectively free.
Yeah, exactly.
Your own labor.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So we'll have to figure that one out.
Yeah, flag this.
That might,
a hunch.
That might be a question for us to solve maybe next week.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Check back.
We'll solve
week.
climate change first.
That's exactly right. And then the Qubit situation.
That's right.
That's
right. We got a busy schedule, man.
Sheesh, man. We need to clear our calendars. Well, while we solve the world's problems, you got anything else, buddy?
I think that's it, boss.
This was a full episode.
It's a full episode.
Amazing.
All right, buddy.
See you next week.
Soon.
Later.
Bye.